Oh my God, so many cool PHP devs, man.
Are we live, Liam? Can you hear me?
Yes, we are. It's just about to go up on the stream now.
All right.
All right.
I use this mouse to...
Yes.
It's good.
Oh my God, so many cool PHP.
Awesome. All right.
I will let you guys go, and I will be joining online. Good luck with everything, and good luck, Jess and Nathan and Cole.
Thanks, Ricardo. You're live on the internet.
Thanks, man.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to our second hybrid PHP meetup. Hopefully we get a bunch more people joining online. First thing I'd like to say is thanks to our sponsors. We've got Info Exchange, Rob here holding down the fort, managing all of our technical issues that we've been having, as well as Nido as well, and CreditSense, who have all kind of been rotating around, giving us venues and pizza and beers and stuff. And then there's also Procure Pro, which is where Tom and I are currently co-founding, and we kind of organize the meetup. So one thing we have, again, is we have pizza voucher giveaways. Well, not really pizza, just Uber Eats giveaways, because we can't do pizza at the event. And also we want to be able to give pizza to our remote viewers as well. So if everyone can just go to this link here, you can just enter your name and email address and go into the draw to win $15 of free food. I think that's everything. There we go. Make sure you follow us on Twitter as well, because that's where we kind of post about the new meetups and that sort of thing. And if you have any ideas for new talks, or if you can offer a talk, or you have an idea for a talk you want to hear, please go to our GitHub, post an issue. It's really good for people who are looking to do a talk but don't really know what they want to do. They can go on there and look up like what people want to hear about. Gives you kind of a pretty good understanding of what the audience wants to hear. And if you have a talk, that's even better. You should definitely just talk about something. Everyone has something they can talk about. You might think you don't, but just write a talk and you'll learn lots about it. So in our first BrisPHP of 2021, we have a few talks. Our first one is the talk I usually do, which is what's new in PHP land, but this time I've palmed it off to Tom, who will be taking that over. And that's so that I can do a talk at the end, Terraforming My World, which will be about how we manage our infrastructure.
Zero.
I don't know why the zeros. I was about to say, Tom, why is there a random zero in your slides? That's a secret.
It's literally that. I can't click it.
10 points to anyone who can guess what the zero is for. And then we also have Jess here, who's going to do a talk about the Laravel Service container. And kind of helping you demystify and understand how that kind of hangs together. So it's not a magic thing that you kind of access with static properties. And again, make sure you enter the draw for pizza. Free food, everyone wants that. So this says we're going to draw the winners, but we're not. We're going to wait and give everyone time to do that. And then Tom will draw the winners after he does his talk about what's new in PHP.
Which is now.
Which is now. Welcome, Tom. Come on up.
Well, thank you. Like 8 people clapping. I'd say it's depressing, but it's not super motivating. Did we say from the same thing? Yeah, we said the same thing twice. Cool. So this is, as Nathan mentioned, usually his talk. I don't know how to use this. There we go. So I was just kind of like cheating off Nathan, which is what I usually do for work anyway, and just like kind of following the same pattern, but I ended up just finding a website that kind of just did it all for me. So the big major release is obviously PHP 8 was end of November. I probably should check that. And there's this really great website, which I only just discovered, called PHP Watch, which I hadn't come across before. It's got really good, like really in-depth breakdowns of like every new feature that comes out in every version. as well as like RFCs, and like each individual feature has like a good like 1,200 words written about it, all the caveats about each one of them. So just wanted to quickly, just to recap sort of the main ones from 8.0. So named parameters, so bane of everyone's existence, needle, haystack, haystack, needle. So now you can pass in the parameter names, and you can actually change the order of these at your way of calling it. So string contains, you could flip those around and it's still valid. It also works really well for situations where you've got just a heap of parameters and you're not really sure the order. Often your IDEs will pull out the name of the parameter, but this kind of makes it a bit more explicit. When I say that this site has a shitload of detail, it really does. Like this is just for that one feature, essentially like how it works, all the edge cases and that sort of stuff. So definitely jump on and have a look at this site. For each one of these, it's really good. Attributes, so we've had doc blocks for ages in PHP. I think the Symfony component for reading this is kind of the most common, the Symfony component. But now you used to have to doc block with @ in a comment, and there was a parser that read the comments to read as theoretically slow and had some issues or whatever. And now that's sort of pulled out to sort of a first-class citizen in the language. There's support for this in like the Symfony component, which I think reads these as well, but I haven't really seen anyone changing their docs to reflect this yet, probably because obviously 8 is still pretty new. I still personally don't really like the syntax, but eventually it'll probably grow on me. Constructor properties, if you're used to TypeScript, this is my most missed feature, switching between TypeScript and PHP. So rather than having to declare private string $name and then in constructor go this name equals $name for 3 or 4 of those things. If you're writing heaps of dependency injection code, you're just going to have the same pattern over and over, and you're wasting a good sort of 30 lines, which is really all just boilerplate stuff. Really, really simplifies it down. You've still got the same public, private, protected. You can chuck on those as well for the type, which is pretty good. The opcache has a JIT compiler. Big fat caveat is there was bug fixes a day before this was released. So tread with caution, and some notes that it makes debugging pretty painful. Union type, so you could only type something like before as one type going in. So your only solution before was to do a doc block @var to type those multiple types. But if you had declare strict types on, it wouldn't check that because you actually can't put in those multiple types in anything before PHP 8. So now you can pipe them all together and say it's any one of these values there. There's a couple more types examples below of some stuff they added at the same time. The null safe operator is awesome. Basically allows short circuiting as soon as you get to any of these returning null. So get address returns an object that implements get country or null. Get country returns a property, an object that has a property called ISO code or null. And rather than getting that error of like calling get country on a null or something like that, can short circuit out of it. This pairs really nicely with null coalescing. That's the one. Double question mark and your default value at the end there. It's really sort of quite brief, which is nice. I was reading this and I'm like, wow, I did not see this come through at all. And then I was looking through Nathan's slides from last time and there was a whole section on it. And I did not pay attention, which is pretty normal. So now you've got switch blocks that are exhaustive, but they're also type safe as well. It must match at least one. You can still have a default parameter in there. It's fascinating. You can still only have one call in there as well. Can't have like multi-lines.
An expression, it's like an arrow function.
Yeah. I don't know what I think about that.
It doesn't get evaluated though until it matches.
Correct. So there's a great example here of somewhere in like this really like complicated one of going through sort of as it's stepping through. It's not calling each one until it like makes its way through, but it doesn't have the it basically each one implements break, so you don't have to add break into each one, which is nice. I think like at least the way I usually would go to reach for a switch statement is you're probably going to chuck a break on each one, and you kind of don't want it to be possible to not have the break on there. weak maps, which I'm gonna be honest, I don't really have a use for them. I'm sure people do, but I live in user land. Everything's fine. Read that. It's probably got more information. Too complicated for me. Because we needed more global namespace functions, they added 3 more for us, quite politely. To be fair, these are actually like really quite helpful because pretty much everyone writes these in some utility function class anyway.
String pos equals 5.
Yeah. String contains, starts with, ends with, really sort of obvious stuff. But again, just more global namespace functions, which is fun. The union types, so more types and improvements. You had union types as well before. Mix is now a type, which is technically a union type of all the different types possible. I thought this was like, oh yeah, I could use mix, but then like reading through this, they recommended still using the union type, which I'm not really sure about, which they're in. Static return type as well, which is pretty good. But the last one to go through, which I thought was pretty cool, which I'm pretty sure Nathan mentioned as well, but completely forgot about, is being able to throw in an expression as well. So in this example, doing your ternary and then in that falsy case, being able to throw an exception there, it makes for really quite brief code, which is quite nice. Definitely sit down with coffee tomorrow morning and just skim through this. Each one of these has a really in-depth page on it, but I'm definitely going to keep an eye on this website sort of in the future as well. And then moving on to the RFCs that have been coming through for 8.1. So there's been a few that have been accepted already. And then one that was actually rejected as of this morning, which is fun. So first one, I think is the most exciting, is enums, which is obviously pretty common in a lot of other programming languages as well. So in this case here, I've got suits, 4 different types of suits. You can't have a suit outside of those. And it's actually sort of, you can use it as a full-on type in your parameters and those sort of things as well. You can add your own like value, I guess, onto that. So like a string of lower clubs, which is probably convenient, you know, if you're serializing down to a front end or with APIs or something. And they actually give you, if you implement, so if you have scalar values on them, it automatically implements this interface, from what I understand, which adds the from and try from. So from will throw an exception if it doesn't match, and try from will return a null. So it looks pretty, like, actually pretty well designed and pretty ergonomic. Again, PHP Watch has a very, very, very in-depth write-up on that. Array unpacking with string keys, a really great little feature. Before, if you had sort of associative array, A pointing to foo, B pointing to bar, try to unpack them together with your 3 dots, it's going to throw an error, and now it will handle that nicely. You can essentially do the same thing with the plus operator now. The difference is that array unpacking will override the duplicate keys, but the plus operator will ignore the duplicate keys, which is a little caveat. And then yet another global namespace function, array is list. So basically, is it just a simple array of values as opposed to a associative array with non-sequential keys or string keys or non-integer keys like this? So all these are fine because it's 0, that still valid, sadly. This is still valid as well, but 0 and foo are sort of non-sequential, and obviously in this case, non-integer keys, so it is not a list. That's new. I also love while we're going through this, is running on Windows right now, and just the Windows emojis are just so much worse. This failed RFC like essentially overnight. So what it was a proposal to add in 2 functions, any and array, which in JavaScript they have array dot, I really should know this, sum and all. I think there's another one. Essentially so that you can pass in a array, iterate over each one, and in the case of any, return true if one of them matches, and in all, return true if all of them match, otherwise return false. This was like basically split like 11 to 12 or 12 to 13, but failed votes because you need 2/3 anyway, with a lot of people citing that it kind of belongs in user land. I also found this really fascinating, that this was the proposed namespace, and like that's the way they wanted to use it. But then we just added like those other string methods in, which were just global namespace. So then there's also voting and stuff going on about like that should just be a global namespace, and then like different proposals for it and all sorts of stuff. But ultimately did not succeed. And then in the framework news, not a great deal. Symfony 5.2 is out. I noticed, like going through the release notes, that there's support for the PHP 8 attributes that we just saw before. They released a rate limited component, which looks pretty similar to the Laravel one that already exists. And they've had a component they've been working on for a while called Symfony Panther, which if you're writing functional tests in Symfony, which is booting like a kernel running a web request against it, but not actually running a web request, you can basically swap out one line and run with Panther against WebDriver. So then you can point it into parameters and stuff. It's interesting to see how that will go sort of in a world where Cypress is really popular now, and there's a couple other things there as well, but at the same time, it's a pretty easy tool if you've got something that's going to be relying on JavaScript that you want to still write a functional test sitting alongside all the other ones as well. It's sitting right there. And then in Laravel, sort of important one was that they've moved to a yearly release cycle instead of every 6 months. So Laravel 9 was supposed to be March, which is now September, which I think is 6 months. So yeah, moving to annual releases, sort of citing that makes it sort of easier to migrate because you're not having to constantly upgrade, constantly chasing the latest release. Gives them a bit more time to plan BC breaks and making sure everything's sort of seamless and upgrade paths as well, which is nice. It's kind of what you expect out of a mature framework as well, so makes sense. Laracon Online, March 17th. It's like, starts like 2 a.m. our time, so grab a coffee or 5. And I noticed in the release notes as well, there's support -- parallel for your tests as well from 8.25, which is pretty good. You have to install like one extra composer package and it seemingly works out of the box, which is cool. And Jetstream is sort of all-in-one starter kit hit a V2 as well, which is looking pretty complete these days. And how about that? We're hiring at the moment. If you're looking for a remote PHP and TypeScript role, sing out. But at the same time, what I'm going to do is draw the pizzas. So, have people done it? You're all going to get pizza if you've submitted. Oh, maybe I'm not on my phone. Has anyone not submitted the pizza? If you've just rocked up late, BrisPHP.com/pizza. Please submit your details so I can give you pizza. Because
There's no one submitted.
it's pretty likely right now you'll get a voucher. This real slowly. First one, Justin. Justin wins pizza. Aaron wins pizza. Well, Uber Eats vouchers, but you get the point. Sam Levy wins pizza. Josh Fry wins pizza. Got to be submitting these forms fast, guys. Come on. Let's see if you must stream in BrisPHP.com/pizza. Come on, before it's too late.
I'm in.
Submit another response. And that's all of that.
Submit another response.
Guillermo wins pizza. Blank wins pizza. That's just an empty row in my Excel spreadsheet. Craig wins pizza. Randall wins pizza.
You get a pizza, you get a pizza.
Feels a bit that way right now. Making sure you don't get pizza twice, but Josh Conahan wins pizza.
Thank you, Erica.
You're welcome. Eric Morano wins pizza. And we're all winning pizza. There we go. Sergey wins pizza as well. So we've got your email address through those forms. That'll be sent out like at some point after this. It's like a little web link with Uber Eats. Enjoy your free pizza. That's all from me. So it's time for Jess. So
Straight up?
yeah, pretty much.
All right.
No ad breaks.
Ad breaks? Yeah. There's more people than last time I turned around.
I got this now.
Thank you. Is someone's mouse, or does that just belong with the?
Yes.
Yeah, it's good.
So I don't get distracted by it and try and use it.
Here you go.
Thank you. Let's see if I can get this going. So. I want to mirror. Let's keep the changes. All right, now can everyone see that?
Do you want to turn
A little bit, yeah.
I'll turn 4 lights.
So,
Number 3. See if that drops the lights down.
Why couldn't it be a light switch? He's about to show
And if it doesn't, push the arrow down button and hold it in for a second.
You know what works well?
And how your tongue is this
This whole building doesn't have light switches. They're all automated.
I don't think off button.
No, just hold there.
that's a bit better.
That's good.
But now the live stream can't see me, but that's better.
Oh, they can see you fine.
Oh, really? I'm
Yeah.
illuminated. Hey, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Let me zoom in.
Zoom in, sure. Zoom in too far.
I think it's zooming in on you with the little
Oh, on that,
sensor
okay.
camera.
Oh, thanks. Thanks a lot.
Enhance.
So my name is Jess Archer. I'm a full stack developer, a podcaster, and a speaker. So I co-host the Base Code podcast with Jason McCreary of Laravel Shift fame, and I've spoken at Laracon AU and was supposed to speak at Laracon US, but then it became Laracon Online because of COVID. I am currently working in the medical technology industry, which is pretty fun. So today I'm going to talk about the Laravel Service container. I'm going to teach you how to build one from scratch. Now, I'm not saying you should actually go out and build one from scratch because there's already a perfect one out there. But for me, in order to truly understand the one we've got, I felt it's helpful to build a basic one from scratch so that you actually know what's going on under the hood. You remove some of that magic. And yeah. So today we're going to be starting with a PHP project. It's not Laravel. So if I just show you the structure, what we've got is an app directory. I've kind of mirrored Laravel's structure, but I'll show you that there's no other secret dependencies installed. So we've got a container. I've scaffolded a few bits and pieces, but we've got the binding resolution exception, which I'm sure we've been bitten by. And if we've got time, I can show you how facades work and a practical example of dependency injection in a controller. And then I've just got a little service here to help with the demo. So I'm going to drive this talk out through tests, which I've already written. And just to real quickly show you the only dependencies, we've got a PHP unit and a so this is entirely from scratch effectively. All right, so if we go to our container test and jump up to our first test. So first test is all about the problems with new. This is talking about the new keyword you'll use in your code, which is new up an instance down here. So the problems with using new in your application code. And when I talk about application code, I'm talking kind of about the userland stuff. So in your controllers, jobs, all that sort of thing. So when you use new, you can't swap it for a mocked version in a test. There's no way to inject into that new statement and swap it out. You can't make that a singleton through new. You're always going to get a new instance. You can't depend on an abstract interface, like for example, a mailer interface. If your application code doesn't care how the mail gets delivered, if it's SMTP or Mailgun or whatever it might be, if you're using new, you've got to new up a concrete instance. You also can't use dependency injection. So any constructor arguments that you need to inject into your SMTP mailer, for example, you've got to put at the time you're calling new. So if you've got, for example, in this case, this SMTP mailer needs an SMTP server string to be passed in. If you've got to put that in every time you need it, you've got to duplicate that around. And if you change the constructor on that, you've got to go through and change it everywhere. So that's where we talk about inversion of control, where you actually centralize all of that newing up of things into one place and move the control from all of your controllers and jobs into your service providers in the case of Laravel. So if we run this test, this test passes because the exception was thrown that there were too few arguments, just to demonstrate that your tests are working. All right, so next test. This is something I've scaffolded ahead of time because it's a little bit boring and annoying to type. So our container itself needs to be a singleton. We don't want to have multiple containers with multiple things bound into them running around all the place. So our container needs to be a singleton. Our container lets us apply the singleton pattern to other classes, but in order to be a singleton itself, we need to use a more old school approach for making it a singleton. So this test is basically just saying that if we ask for 2 instances of this container, that we get the same instance. And if we attempt to new it up, we actually get an exception. So if we run this test, that passes. And that's because what we've scaffolded here, we've basically got a static property where we store the instance that we new up. We've made the constructor private, so we can't new it up. And we've created this get instance method, which we can call whatever we want, but I've used the names that Laravel uses so that things will be familiar for you. So here we're basically saying that if there is no instance, new one up, but once you've done this once, every single time, you'll just return the one we've already stored globally. So let's get on to some actual coding now. So this is a test to say that we can provide instructions for resolving a class. So one of the things we talked about with our container is that it allows us to have inversion of control. So we can define how a class gets newed up in a central location and then just ask the container, hey, give me one of those. I don't care how you get it, just give it to me. So the way we do that in Laravel is typically with this bind command. We pass in what Laravel calls the abstract, but it can be anything you want. And then we pass in a second parameter, which is the closure, to say how to new that up. So in this case, I've just got a very simple one where we're just returning that. Now this closure won't get executed until we resolve it, which we can see down here. We're using container make. Now Laravel's container, the make and the resolve methods are just aliases for each other, so you can use them interchangeably. So here we've got, we're asking the container to make us an SMTP mailer, and then we're asserting we get an instance of it. And we're double checking that if we call it again, that we don't get the same instance. So if we run this test, this one will fail. Big fat red because we have no bind method. So let's, we've gone to our binding resolution exception. Let's implement that now. So public function bind. Now the first parameter is a string and Laravel calls it abstract. The second parameter is a closure, which we will call concrete. And that needs, let's just import it later. All right, so we need to store this closure that's being passed in somewhere so we can call it later. So I've often said that containers are basically, like at their heart, just a big array of key values. So we'll create that array. We'll say, bindings, abstract. So we use whatever name we pass in, and we'll store that concrete class on there. And we'll import the closure into our namespace. All right, so that's the first part. That lets us bind something, which basically is just storing the closure in an array. The second part is asking it to make it. So we'll say make, and again, we'll say string abstract, and we'll say that this one will return mixed. Now I'm using a lot of PHP 8 stuff here, so it's a good thing that Tom taught you about some of that stuff if you didn't already know it. And in the simplest case here, we're just going to return this bindings, abstract. We're going to put the brackets on the end, so we're actually calling the closure now. So if we run this one, that one passes. So that's the most basic implementation of a service container. So if we go to our next test, we can also use a string for a key. So you might have seen in Laravel, they've got some of these kind of like magic strings that allow you to have some sort of a kind of abstract name for the thing you're asking for. So a mailer is a common one in Laravel. Now you might have noticed that we asked for a string in our bind method. So this test automatically works without having to do anything to it. Because before, when we were binding using the double colon class syntax, that just resolves to a string. It's an arbitrary string. It doesn't actually have to be a class. It can be anything we like. I've also used the short arrow function here because I think they're cool. All right, now we can also bind an interface to a concretion. So this is a kind of common one. Now I've put a note here, actually, just to say that just because we can use interfaces doesn't mean we always should. I've fallen into the trap in the past where I felt like everything I built needed to have an interface because I needed to swap it out at runtime and all these other things. And what I kind of realized later on was that the userland code I'm building, I'm never really going to do that. And the extra complexity it adds by having all these interfaces doesn't pay off. It just makes things harder to refactor later and harder to communicate what's going on. So with that caveat said, here we are using the mailer interface as what we're binding as the string name and newing it up. And then we ask it to make a mailer interface, and we're asserting that we get an instance of SMTP mailer. And without doing anything, this test also passes, which is pretty cool. All right, so next test. We can replace an existing binding. Now this is common in tests. So you might have a service provider where you're binding your mailer interface and saying that when I ask for a mailer interface, I want this SMTP mailer. But in your test, you could replace that binding by just calling bind again and say that this time, I actually want you to provide a mocked version of the SMTP mailer instead of the real thing. So in your controller, or wherever it might be, you can call container make mailer interface. But because we've swapped it, we're actually going to get an instance of our mock interface because we've run this in our test. So if we run this one, that works as well. We can already do this with those simple little array and calling that. So what have we got so far? We've got inversion of control. We can now centralize how we new up our classes. We can depend on an abstraction, for example, an interface or even an arbitrary string. And we can also substitute a mock version in a test. And I put an asterisk there because we'll get to singletons later, which make that a little bit nicer. So things we don't have yet, a zero config resolution, which we'll talk about shortly. We don't have singletons, and we don't have dependency injection yet. So next one. So we can pass a concrete class as the second parameter. So this one's a common one. If you've got, for example, I've got this array mailer. Now this class doesn't have any constructor arguments it needs. But if I want to say that in this particular scenario, I still want to depend on an interface in my controller code and then bind a class for it, let's support that. It's not too hard, right? So if we run this now, this is going to fail because we've told it that the second parameter always has to be a closure. So let's just make this thing a little bit more featureful. So let's say this can now accept a string.
So good. So good.
And then down here, what we'll do is we'll store we'll store that as our concrete. Whoop, I just heard my voice coming from over there. All right, we can now say that if our concrete is an instance of a closure, then we'll return concrete and put the brackets on the end to just call the closure as we were before. But otherwise, let's try and new it up. So we run this test, and that one passes with just that small little change. We can now bind with just a class as the second parameter. All right, next one. We can also make classes we've never seen, aka zero config resolution. So if you've got a class that doesn't need any help being newed up, you don't actually have to register it in Laravel and in mini containers. You don't have to register it in your service provider. You can just call make, and the container will resolve that for you. So at the moment though, this won't work. Oops, I've jumped. How did I jump so far ahead? Interface to completion. Place the binding. Sorry. This is the one. All right. So if we run this one fails because it's a pretty obscure error for this one. But if we look at what we've got to do, actually just a reminder. So we're wanting to resolve classes we've never seen before. So when we're calling our make method, we're basically passing in this array mailer, but it's never seen it before. So what we can do here is, in this case here, this binding abstract doesn't exist. So this is kind of what's failing. So we can actually just say, if there is no binding for it, we're going to call the abstract our concrete. And if it's not a closure, it's going to try and new it up. So if we run this one, that one passes. Small little change, which is pretty cool. Now we can recursively resolve. This is where it gets pretty cool. So I'm just going to double check that. Yeah, I haven't skipped anything. Cool. All right. So in this particular case, in this example at least, we're binding our mailer interface to our SMTP mailer class, but we haven't told it how to resolve the SMTP mailer class. So we've got a second binding saying to resolve the SMTP mailer class, here's the instructions to bind that. But because of the way we've built it at the moment, this test is going to fail. Too few arguments because it tries to new up the SMTP mailer straight away. So how can we make this recursively resolve? So got to try and remember how I do this one now. Okay, cool. So all this logic down here is kind of resolved to building our object. So we're actually going to extract this to a separate method called build, which accepts a closure for a string concrete. And we'll return mixed, like the other one does. And over here, what we can now say is, to start this off, let's just say return this build concrete. So that's basically where we were before. So to make this recursive, what we can do is say if our concrete is an instance of closure or our concrete is equal to our abstract, so basically it hasn't heard of it before, then we will try and build it. However, otherwise, we'll recursively call make on it. So this will basically cycle back through it until it doesn't know what it is any longer, and then it will try and build it. So this one should now work. That's the trickiest one. So hopefully you can see what's going on there, but yeah, effectively, if it knows that it's a closure, it knows how to build it, it can pass it straight to build. If the concrete is equal to the abstract, it means it's never heard of it before, and we'll pass it to build. Now the second time, so yeah, but if it has heard of it, then it will come back to make. I hope that makes sense. I feel like it's not making sense now, but if it doesn't, talk to me after. All right, so we can also bind a singleton. So singleton pattern, for anyone that's not aware, is pretty powerful when you have a service typically in your code and you only want the one instance to exist everywhere. So the classic example is a database. You don't want a database connection every time you want that connection. So every time you want to talk to the database, you get a new instance, it opens a new connection to your database, and all of a sudden your code has opened up 20 connections to your database for one request. So we want to make sure we reuse that same class every time we need it. And that's where the singleton pattern comes in. So we have to add a new method to our container called singleton, but otherwise the parameters are the same. We pass in our abstract and we give it an instructions for how to resolve it. But in this case, when we call make twice on that same thing, we're going to assert that we get the same one and that it's an instance of SMTP mailer. If we run this now, it's going to fail because we don't have a singleton method. So let's do that one first. So let's do under our bind, we'll create a new method called singleton. Same arguments as our one from before. And this one is going to defer to the bind method and pass in the abstract and the concrete. But it's also going to pass in one extra parameter, which is just true. So this is the way that Laravel does it. They have this extra parameter on the end of our bind method, which is called shared. By default, it's false. And this parameter might as well be called singleton, but they just use the word shared. So we need to store this now. When we're binding, we need to store this somewhere. So this array we had before, this actually needs to become a multi-dimensional array. So we can store our concrete, oops, and store whether it is shared. Which also means that down in our little make code here, we need to pull that out from concrete because we're using our little null coalesce operator. It doesn't matter if that doesn't exist. So that should let us bind. And now we should get a different error, which says that failed asserting that two variables reference the same object. So we're still not getting a singleton. We've made this method work, but it's not actually doing anything special for us. So what do we need to do now? We need to store, before we return the thing we've built, we need to store it somewhere. So we need to put it in a temporary variable, unfortunately. And on our, we can't return early now, so I don't know. Okay. So this code will come up to here. And then we can return this. So at the moment, that's functionally equivalent to what we just had before. But what we can do now is say that if the bindings for this abstract, if it has that, and that value is true, Just go say if it's truthy. So if that is the case, we're going to just store that somewhere. So we're going to say this instances abstract equals an object. So we're just going to store it somewhere. Now we've got to create that property to hold it. So let's go up here and just create it protected. I never created that method actually. I've got to have it protected array bindings. I should have created that earlier, but PHP lets it work without it. So so we'll store our instances as well. It's a little bit confusing. You've got instance and instances. That's how it exists in Laravel. So that's good enough for me. All right. So that works. We're now storing it if it's a singleton, but we've also got to make sure that we actually return it if we have already saved it into our instances. So right at the top of our make method, we're just going to say if is set this instances abstract return this instances abstract. So that adds a fair bit more code to something that was really, really simple before. So hopefully you followed along with that. But really what we're doing is just when we've built it, we store it somewhere if it's shared. And if we have already built it in the past, then we can return the instance of that every time. So if we go back to our test now and run that one's passing. So we have singletons now, which is pretty cool. So test defines a singleton by passing the instance. This one's pretty common in tests where you have a mocked instance. You've already set up the mock and you've already set up all of the expectations on the mock and you want to pass in that instance. So you don't want to pass in like a closure to tell it how to resolve it. You just want to pass in just the instance of it because you've already come prepared it. So Laravel provides this instance method. And if you've ever seen on a test where you have a this swap method behind the scenes, if I go to my test case, I've created this here, our swap method literally just calls the instance method behind the scenes. So that's kind of how Laravel's swap method works as well on the test case. All right, so if we run this at the moment, instance is going to fail because there's no instance method. So let's make that one. So I'll pop it under our singleton method, public function instance. Again, we've got to accept our abstract, but this time we're going to accept a mixed instance. Now, according to that thing, maybe mixed isn't okay to use, but I'm going to use it.
Good enough for me.
Now, Laravel doesn't use all these type ints and everything everywhere, but I wanted to because
Yeah.
why not? Yeah, that's a good point. So we're going to store that in our instances variable, similar to how we did before. Instance. All right. So we've added that into our instances array. That's all we need to do because we've already got the code that says that if an instance has been passed in, we're going to return it. So if we run that one passes as well. All right, next one. Test defines a singleton by class name only. So before I talked about how you don't need to, in your service provider, bind something if it doesn't need any help resolving. With a singleton, you've got to tell it somewhere to be a singleton. But if you've got a class that doesn't actually need any help being resolved, you don't really want to have to provide in that second parameter is just saying new array mailer in this case if it doesn't need any help. So let's fix that one. So at the moment, if we run this test, it's going to fail because we haven't passed enough arguments into our singleton method. At the moment, it's expecting us to tell it, give it a closure or a string for that. So if we go to our singleton method and we basically say the second parameter is nullable and by default it's null. We also need to make sure we accept null on our bind method. But on our bind method, we'll still say you've got to pass one in. All right. So that, I don't remember where I was, okay, so that alone works. There you go. I forgot that was going to work. So let's just explore why that works, because I've actually forgot why that works. I want to find out why. All right, so we've passed in null, which means that we've told it that it has an entry in this bindings array with concrete as null, but it has our shared equals true property. So that's the thing that tells it when you resolve this for the first time, store it. But because we've added our code later on, it says that if you've never seen the concrete before, we're going to store that. That's all we need. It doesn't matter that concrete is null because our null coalesce operator will work if it's not there or if it's null. It will just try and resolve the thing that was passed in, the abstract version of it effectively. So that's pretty cool. All right. Test it does dependency injection. All right, so this API mailer, let's have a look at it. It's got a constructor. I'm using PHP 8's ability to not have to do all that rigmarole of setting things. This one requires an API class. Now this API class doesn't require anything to be resolved, but the API mailer on its own still needs to know this API class. So if we go back to our test here, so we want to be able to make this API mailer. Now in theory, it shouldn't need any help to resolve this because the API mailer needs the API class, but the API class doesn't need anything. There's no strings or arbitrary things you've got to tell it how to resolve. It's all things that are concrete. So if we run this now though, this one fails for long reasons. Too few arguments, cool. So let's make that one work now. This one's probably the second one that's a little bit gnarly. All right, so what we need to do for our build method is, so I've got to remember this one now. Dependency injection needs to resolve, needs to be recursive, which means that we've got our build method. Where do I put this one? I've forgotten what I'm doing here now. Run that one. That doesn't work. So our make method, let's just walk through it together, shall we? Our make method has the thing that can't be resolved. Why can't I remember how I do this one?
Do you need to get like the constructor parameters with some like function bullshit?
Yes, thank you. This is the really gnarly one, actually. Thank you very much. All right.
I have no idea what I'm doing.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. That's all I needed. So this is where it's crazy because we're calling return new concrete. This is where it's like, it's basically reached the end of its line. Now the code beyond this all right, so if we take our build